So, excuse my grammar. But as you can see, the session objective today is just to help you all kind of feel more confident participating in podcasts, but also pitching your own podcast ideas on our Just Us and the Climate podcast. If you haven't already, I would go onto our podcast. Platform. We're on almost every single platform that you can listen to podcasts on, and just have a listen to one of the podcasts that you feel is interesting to you, just so you can kind of understand what we do. But I'll get more into it now. I think. Oh, let me just go back. What do you, I guess a question for you all is, what do you think in the podcast that you've listened to, or maybe if you listen to the radio, what do you think makes a good podcast guest or a good person to listen to on audio? Anyone? Is what do you think it takes to sound good on audio or be good on a podcast as a listener? Tsiriso?
Morning, everyone. Come, for myself, I
Mhm.
think it's a manner of approach in terms of
Mm,
how does a broadcaster introduces his main subject of the content, the introduction. For me, it's very important because of that's the
mm,
main key which can attract an individual's attention to be able to have an interest to say, you know what, I really want to listen to this. Some of the podcasts you can find that it's really exciting along the way as it goes on, but you
mm,
lose. But most of people I've realized about myself, I lose interest after listening to the introduction. Some of the broadcasters, they can't hit the right spot in terms of how they introduce the subject of the content for the day.
mm.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Kam. That's such a good um it's such a good example because when you think about it, we live in a world where we are competing for attention. We're constantly competing for people's attention. And if you want someone to listen to your podcast, to spend 30 minutes or 40 minutes that they could use doing anything in the world to listen to what you have to say, your introduction really does have to be gripping. So thanks for that, Com. Mutlatsi?
Thank you, Kwam. Just to add to what Mukit was saying, uh, also a person that does not understand his subject, that speaks very long, like you are saying, attention is something that we are competing. So that's my input. Thank you.
Absolutely. Understanding what you want to say and how you're going to say it, and making sure you've, whether if it's research based, done the relevant research, if it's lived experience based, making sure you kind of understand, okay, this is what I want to communicate to people when I'm speaking. Absolutely, Com. Thank you for that. Busi?
For me, it's very important that the person is using language that is relatable. I think often we get lost in the jargon, and I personally don't like it when I'm listening to a podcast and I have no idea what this person is saying, but they're saying a lot. So using everyday simple terms works for me.
That's also another great one, especially because we're in the climate movement and people are saying the ECG and the FER and and if you don't know what on earth these things mean, you're just going to think, okay, I can't listen to this podcast. This podcast was not created for me. It was created for people who know what all of these things mean, or all of this like high-tech language. Absolutely. Thanks for that, Busi. I think at Siri, so I'm going to give Shakila before you, just because you've already been. So I'll go Shakila, Nomfundo, and then back to you, Tsidiso, and then I think we're going to move to the slide.
So I think just following on what some of the previous speakers have said, is that I think what often makes a really good podcast is not only when the guest is passionate about what it is that they're doing, but also when the host is incredibly passionate and interested and curious about the work and has done like research or reading beyond just what the guest has provided or what the guest has done to sort of inform the topic. That often makes a really great, really great podcast.
Yeah, I think that's such a good one because the host is kind of the director of the conversation. So the host needs to be curious and actually really listening to what the guests have to say, to ask interesting questions, to add in some filler information, for example, to know what's relevant as well, to know, like, as the host, you might want to add something to make what your guest is saying stronger. And knowing if you can do that, or if it's going to make it stronger, or if you're going to then, start taking away from the guest. I think being a host is also very, very important. Nomfundo?
Thank you so much, Shazia. I'm just piggybacking on what Busi was saying. Thank you so much. Love it. But also just around the simplicity of language, can we also be wary of the generational language usage? Because I'm an old school, and I realize with the youngins, they're sort of using a different terms, but it's more simpler for them to kind of comprehend. So can we sort of bridge that in the midst of us finding the simplicity of language? Thank you so much, Shazia.
That is such a good point as well, because what you want to do in your podcast is you want to keep your audience as broad as possible. So you need to think about, as Nomfundo is saying, the language that you're using. Who are you excluding and who are you including in the way you choose to communicate? So that's a great one. I think, Tsiri, so if you want to add before we move.
Yes, Chair. Again, you might be intrigued. However, something I've learned again, it's a tone and level of register. You find that some of podcasters are too quick. Their level of register is too quick. So in this regards, I've learned that you mustn't be too quick and you mustn't be slow as well. At least be on a medium-term base in terms of delivering your content. Thanks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think sometimes why people go quicker is maybe they're feeling a little bit nervous. And so you kind of want to get through the content as quick as possible. And it's always a good idea just to slow down, because the more you slow down, the more you actually find the words to communicate what you want to say in the best way possible. So thanks for that. Let's see what I have also added to what we've said. So I think something that makes a good podcast guest is someone who, like, the key thing is you don't have to sound perfect. You don't have to have the perfect English. You don't have to have the perfect vocabulary. You need to be honest and relatable. And you need to be very clear about your experiences or ideas. So, on Just Us and the Climate, we're not necessarily only going to be speaking about policy or science. Of course, we do speak about things like that, but we're very interested in lived experience. So, if you're speaking about, for example, what it feels like to have had no water for a full week, kind of be clear about that experience, be as relatable as possible, speak honestly. So it kind of goes as well with all the things that we were saying. And passionate about the topic. When you're passionate about a topic, people can pick up on that immediately. And I speak for myself, but probably for a lot of us here, when someone is passionate about what they're saying, it almost makes you want to listen to more of what they're saying. And the more you're also willing to share your stories, share your lived experience, share your own lessons and reflections, the more valuable what you say is going to be. So I will say that. And remember, at any time, if you want to add something or ask a question, please put your hand up. And more things that you don't need. What you don't need is a radio voice. You don't need to sound like someone on 702. You don't even need media training experience. What I'm telling you now is almost it's very basic. You don't need deep media experience to be a good podcast guest. I mean, just ask Matlatsi with no training whatsoever. He made a beautiful, beautiful podcast last year, as long as you can do the things that we've been discussing. You don't need academic language. You don't need to know everything. Of course, you need to have done the research and kind of know what you're going to be speaking about, but you don't need to be an absolute expert on the topic to be a good podcast guest. And then, of course, you don't need perfect English. In fact, we do encourage folks, especially on Just Us and the Climate, to use language you're comfortable in, to use vernacular. Of course, it depends on your host as well. Hopefully, your host can understand what you're saying, but speak in a way that you're comfortable. Because what all of you already have is a valuable lived experience. You already do organizing work on the ground, and that is a form. It's not. It's a form of expertise, and it's something that not everybody has. So already, what you bring to the table is really valuable. It's something that people want to listen to. It's something that's going to help a lot of people. So I guess just to reassure everyone that you all are ready. You're ready to be a good podcast guest. Okay, let's move on. Oh, does anyone have any questions before I continue? I think we kind of all understand a little bit about what's a good podcast guest. Maybe just speaking about what Just Us and the Climate is. So if you haven't listened to any of our podcasts, which I do urge you to do, maybe someone can put a link in the chat where, like our podcast page. Sorry, because I can't type right
Already
now.
there.
Oh, thank you, Boosie. This platform is it's a resource that belongs to all of us. So I'm not in charge of the podcast. I help facilitate the podcast. The secretariat isn't in charge. The steering committee is not in charge. It's a resource that belongs to everyone. So if you find something that's super important that you want to speak about that relates to climate justice, community struggles and resistance, worker and energy justice, climate policy, feminist / working class / grassroots organizing, everyday impacts of climate change, stories from affected communities, anything that represents the work that we do here at the coalition, and you want to do a podcast on that, you're absolutely welcome to use the resource. And I think the session is also about teaching you how to access the podcast and make the best use of it possible. Okay. Again, as I've said, our podcast values more accessible and grounded, people-centered conversations over overly technical language. Like you'll see our slogan is bringing climate justice back down to earth. So making it as understandable to as many people as possible. So yeah. And again, anyone can organize a podcast. Be prepared and be committed to what you want to do, because you can't just say, oh, I want to make a podcast and then start recording. There is a level of preparation and commitment that it takes, but it's really simple. So here are the two main ways that you can get involved, right? Whoops. The first is you can come to me and you can tell me, I want to cover, I don't know, I want to cover the electricity prices in my community. This is something that I find is really important. be prepared to tell me why you think it's important so that I can say, okay, this is important. You're not just going to come here and speak about, I don't know, why you don't want to pay your electricity bill. Like you actually see why it's important and relevant for people to understand that this is an issue. And then what I can help you with is developing the concept, help you to identify potential hosts if you don't want to host it, or guests if you want to host it. I can help you with structuring the discussion and scheduling the recording, and of course with promotion and distribution of the podcast. And that's if you just have an idea. And then if you want a more hands-on approach, and say you've got, like for example, you'll see that the legal working group does podcasts all the time. So they know exactly how it works. So if Comrade Rob tells me that he wants to do a podcast, I already know he knows exactly how the process works. He kind of just tells me, okay, we're doing a podcast on the Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone. These are our guests. This is who's going to speak. This is when we want to do it. And then I kind of just help him with coordination. And hopefully everybody will get to that stage at some point. But for now, I'm there to help you with every step. So I know Comrade Velile wants to make a podcast on artisanal mining or mining. So that's like a broad idea. And I'm going to urge you, Com, to think about it a little bit more, to think what exactly you want to speak about. Who could be potential guests? Who do you think will help people understand the topic more? Maybe you want to speak to a community member who is affected by mining. Maybe you want to speak to an actual artisanal miner who makes their living from this profession. Maybe you want to speak to kind of like a body of an organization who represents artisanal miners, like someone at Makua. And then you kind of flesh out who you want to speak to and how it's going to kind of come together. Are there any questions at this stage or anything people want to add? No, I can't even see hands. So anyway, okay, I'm going to move on. Oops. Okay. So, oh, I can't click on it right now, but I'm going to go through the template with you. So when you tell me you want to do a podcast, I'm going to send you a document that is a Just Us and the Climate template, a podcast pitch template. And these are the things that you're going to have to include in that template. This is part of the preparation that you'll need to do ahead of the podcast. And in fact, if you're doing a podcast, even on another platform, I will encourage you to add all of these things into your planning. So the first thing you need to include in your planning or in your pitch is a podcast title. And here, sometimes the podcast title comes after you've planned the entire thing, because sometimes you don't exactly know what the title is. It emerges as you start planning. But you think of a title. Even when you're starting planning, you could just write the subject of what you're going to speak about, and then the title can come to you. So we need to choose a title that is very clear, engaging, and relevant to the discussion. And it also needs to be, because of the time that we live in now, search engine optimized. So what you want to do is, because we're thinking about how we're competing with hundreds and hundreds of podcasts and articles and videos all on the internet, you want your title to be as representative of what you're speaking about as possible. So if you're speaking about, I don't know, I guess the Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone, you want that to be in the title. You don't want some vague title like how government projects are going to destroy the land or something. You want Messina Mercado Special Economic Zone to be in that title. So if someone searches that on Google, your podcast is going to come up. Does that make sense to people? If not, you're obviously welcome to put your hand up. Cool. And then B is host and guests. Now, sometimes I know you might want like six people because they're all just so good on a topic. This person knows this and that person knows that. But the more hosts and guests you have, the more confusing it can get for a listener. Because when you're thinking about the podcast as a medium, the podcast that we do specifically, there is no video. So it's just voices. The more voices you add, the more confusing it gets, and also the longer the podcast gets, which I'll get to eventually. But you don't want a 2-hour podcast because unfortunately, no one's going to listen to a 2-hour podcast. So you want to keep your host and guests to 2 to 3 people. So either it's like 2 people speaking, one person that's more of a host if it's interview style, or 2 people having a conversation, or 3. At most, I would say at most, we've done this before. At most, you could have 4 people, but it really does get tricky because you also want to give everybody kind of equal airtime. If I have Nomfundo and Shakila and Sidiso, but I'm only speaking to Nomfundo and a little bit of Shakila, and then now and then Sidiso makes a comment, it doesn't sound democratic. It also makes it sound like Nomfundo is the only person who has something valuable to say. You want to kind of make sure everybody gets as much airtime as the other. And then another thing is you want diverse perspectives. So if Shakila and sorry, both your names are like right in front of me. That's why I'm using you as examples. If the 2 of you are both experts on economic and climate justice, it might strengthen the discussion to bring, instead of Shakila, to bring Busi in because maybe Busi has lived experience, or maybe Busi wrote a book or something that kind of diversifies the perspectives. You don't necessarily want 3 of the same people. So in the example of Velile's podcast on artisanal mining, you don't want Velile as the host and 2 artisanal miners necessarily, because I mean, that could be interesting, but you kind of want to diversify the experiences. So maybe we have one artisanal miner, and then we have one person in the community that has been affected by, I don't know, affected by laws against artisanal miners, like maybe I don't know, a community leader, I don't know. Something that kind of diversifies the discussion a little bit. And then another thing is that guests should have some kind of expertise. We're also not just going to call our friend. I'm not just going to say, oh, my friend, I love speaking to my friend, so I'm going to bring my friend on the podcast. The person has to be relevant. So we're going to be very strategic when we're posing who our host and who our guests are on a podcast and thinking about what they're bringing to the conversation. Okay. And then another thing I'm going to ask you on that podcast pitch, or if you're just speaking on another podcast, what you're going to plan for is episode format. So you're going to think about what style of conversation best suits the podcast. So is it going to be interview style, where, for example, Busi wrote a book, a very amazing book on, I don't know, women in climate justice. And I am interviewing Busi about the book, the process, what's in the book, why, etc. Interview style. Maybe we're going to say we're having a panel discussion. This is something that I think a lot of us are most familiar with. So there's one host and maybe like 3 or 4 questions, and we pose those 3 or 4 questions to each guest, and we see how their different perspective or their different expertise kind of reflects on the topic. A great episode format as well is storytelling. So Storytelling and narrative or audio take a little bit more time, but say you want to talk to the exact experience. So maybe we're speaking about a specific community, maybe a rural community that doesn't have access to running water. And then you kind of tell the story. I think some of the storytelling narrative that you see has come a lot from Carolina Eco Green. I think I did see Comrade Eddie's in here, but they've done a lot of storytelling or narrative audio a documentary. That takes a little bit more planning. It's less simple than interview style or panel discussion, but also a beautiful way, especially when we go into lived experience. Could have a roundtable conversation. You could also have community reflections. So just have that also works very well for lived experience. So I would say interview style, panel discussion, roundtable conversation. Yes, they are for a lived experience, but sometimes also work better when you have technical expertise. We won't necessarily, if we're doing a technical podcast, we won't necessarily choose storytelling or narrative audio or community reflection. So just kind of think about what kind of story you want to tell, how you want to tell the story. And I can also, what I can do as well is when I send you this presentation, I can add examples. I can link examples to each one of these descriptions, so you can double check when you're pitching your podcast or thinking about your podcast, what kind of format works for you. Okay. And then the other thing that you need to ask yourself for this, but for any kind of media, is who is your target audience? Who is the episode for? What age group are you trying to reach? So perhaps you are making a podcast about Youth Day, and we have a whole lot of youth, and now youth are going to use jargon that, for example, the older generation doesn't necessarily understand. Fine, we'll allow it that time because perhaps the audience is youth. Are you trying to, maybe you're actually trying to target policymakers or the government? Then the type of podcast you're doing is also going to be a little bit different because you're gearing towards your audience. Are you, for example, just trying to target the general public? Then we need to think about how accessible the language is. I mean, we always need accessible language, but even more accessible. How can we speak to someone who has no idea what climate change even is? The clearer your understanding about who your audience is, the easier it is to shape the conversation. The easier it will even be to think about questions you want to ask, who the guests are, how you're going to promote it, for example. So that's an audience. And then discussion description. So this would be what you would spend the most time on when you're planning your podcast. So this is going to explain what's the episode going to be about, just in short. Why does the conversation matter now? Why is this relevant? Why should someone listen to what you have to say for 30 to 40 minutes and not watch TV, go outside, go shopping, whatever people do? Think about what listeners will learn. What do you want them to get out of listening to your podcast? So after 30 to 35 minutes, what information should they take with them? What feeling should they be left with after they listen to what you're saying? And then also importantly, why is this issue important to movements and communities? Why is this issue important to the rest of the CJC or to other communities? How is it going to inspire them, help them, teach them, etc.? This is where you kind of, it's, as I say, it's the heart of the pitch. Okay. Okay. Any questions? Are you guys tired of listening to my voice? Maybe someone can say something, or I can just move on. Okay, no questions that I can tell. Cool. Okay. Icebreakers. Now, this is optional, but it can work well. So, an icebreaker is kind of a question that is unrelated to the contents of the podcast, but can help the guests relax or create a more conversational atmosphere. So, for example, you could do two truths and a lie or desert island questions. Like, if you had a magic wand, what would you change in the world? I think in a podcast I did with Mbali and Alex, um, a couple of years ago, we did an icebreaker, and that was a little bit necessary because the two of them were um, at the time DS and GS of the coalition, and maybe people maybe had a little bit of a formidable, a little bit unapproachable of a demeanor. So the icebreaker almost like humanized them and made you see them as like, just people, and almost made because the conversation then became really vulnerable. That particular podcast was on leadership and reflections on the CJC, kind of just like broke the ice a little bit. So it served a purpose. So I think sometimes an icebreaker could be good, specifically if like, say for example, we have a government official or something. I don't know why we would. Maybe we have someone. Oh, actually, we have had a government official with Mutlatsi, who helped us with the IDPs. So sometimes it can help people, like help humanize the guests and help kind of bring the conversation a little bit to earth. So yeah, you can think about whether you want to do an icebreaker or not. Sometimes the reason why people don't do icebreakers is because they take up time. So if you only have 30 to 40 minutes to have a conversation and you know the icebreaker is going to take up a valuable 5 minutes, you have to think about whether or not you want to include that. Okay, that's on icebreakers. And then also important whenever you're planning, but also when you're planning with us, is you need a list of questions and themes and talking points, whichever one is easy for you. So for example, if you're having an interview style, a straight interview style podcast or a roundtable, you need your main interview questions. If you're having community reflections or narrative audio, you need to think about your main themes, your talking points, your stories or examples that guests can reflect on. So this is what's going to help you feel prepared going into any podcast. Whether you're a guest and you have the list of questions, so you kind of know, you can kind of think about what your answers are going to be, or whether you're reflecting and you're writing key talking points or stories. This will help you to kind of ground yourself in what you originally wanted to say. So when you get there, you don't panic. Not that you should ever panic in a podcast because it's edited. So whenever you panic, you can edit the panic out. But this is going to help you feel prepared. And this is something that you should always do whenever you're a guest on a podcast. And this wouldn't be a word for word what you're saying. I wouldn't write a script for exactly how I'm going to answer the question because I also want to sound natural and I want to sound relatable. So if I don't know, wrote word for word what I'm going to say, sometimes that can make you sound very written, if that makes sense, because there's a way that we write and there's a way that we speak. And you want to be as relatable and accessible in the way that you're speaking, as natural as possible, because that will also endear the audience to what you're saying or help them to connect with you. Okay, any questions, any comments? None. Cool. Yeah, and then like kind of lastly, we think about the roundup and promotion. So this is mainly for me because I will be doing this, but you could think about, say, for example, you're talking to a specific guest. Think about where about their Instagram or their TikTok or whatever their social media handles are. So maybe listeners can follow them, maybe they can continue the conversation. Or if you're speaking about a specific campaign or an action, maybe there's a website or a poster or some details. Those are the things like, when you watching something on YouTube or you're listening to a podcast and the host always says, whatever I speak about can be linked in the bio. So this is what's going to be linked in the bio. You need to think about that. And then also, if you have any specific social media promotion ideas. So usually what we do is we put the podcast on all of our social media platforms. We email it to members. And the first one is like a static post where we just have the topic and the guests. And then the second one is usually a quote, which becomes a reel or TikTok that we also share. But if you have any other ideas for how to promote the podcast, something, maybe you want to have a listening party. I don't know. This is the space where you can kind of write about that. And if you have any partner organizations that we need to collaborate post with, that's also where you put that in. So yeah, that's roundup and promotion. Okay, and then episode length. So the recommended podcast length is between 30 and 50 minutes. As much as sometimes people will listen to something that's an hour, but it always depends. And I think it's always better to be a little bit more safe. So to err on the side of like a 30 to 40 minutes, you don't even necessarily want to go to 50 minutes. And that's also why you need to think about how many guests you have, because the more guests you have, the more time gets tacked on to the end of your podcast. So try and keep it between 30 and 50 minutes. And it's also a good idea to see how many questions you have. So if you have more than, like, you want to keep your questions, if you have two guests and one host, 5 to 6 questions are more than enough. You do not need 10 questions because that's going to just set you up for an hour and a half podcast. And then another thing I'll ask you is your recording and launch dates. So with our podcast specifically, if you record today on a Tuesday, it's probably with editing and things, it's only going to be launched next week. These things take time because a podcast needs to be edited. But so that's just something to think about. If, for example, you are doing a podcast that you want to come out on Youth Day, you need to make sure that you've recorded that podcast at least 10 days in advance so that it can be ready for Youth Day. Okay. Yes. Okay. Final tips for a strong pitch. So strong podcast pitches are clear, focused, grounded in lived experience or story. They're timely and relevant. They're accessible to broad audiences. And specifically for our podcast, they're connected to organizing, to justice, to movement building. And always the goal for particularly our podcast is to have a meaningful conversation that in some way, shape, or form educates, inspires, and strengthens solidarity. Now I'm going to give someone a chance to say something. Anyone have anything to add, maybe something you think I missed out, or maybe a question. Now is your chance. Anyone? Or else I'm just going to have to go on.
Yeah, Chase.
Temba?
Yeah, well, what background should one have? Could we have some music or maybe playing?
Oh,
I'm just thinking of the
actually,
background. Yeah.
okay, that's a good question. We actually don't usually have music. So what happens with our podcast is you'll record it, and the
Yeah.
editors of our podcast will add a little bit of a jingle. They'll add like our intro and our outro, and most podcasts will have that. And because we're not necessarily making the podcast, we are the guests. We don't necessarily have to worry about that. But for example, if you have an idea, like say you want a specific maybe struggle song or something to be played in the background, that would be, and that somehow strengthens or is relevant to what you were speaking about, then absolutely you can plug that in somewhere and make a note of it for the editors, and then we'll add that in. Does that answer your question? I hope so.
Great.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Now, how to prepare for a podcast interview. So if you're a guest, what you need to think about is what are 2 to 3 key messages that you want listeners to remember. And I would encourage you to write this down. Okay. I mean, you can think about it in your head, but maybe writing it down on a notepad is always a good idea. Then what stories or examples can explain your point? And I'm going to encourage you to use stories and examples. So, the opposite of what we were talking about before, where a podcast is unrelatable and it's filled with jargon, the opposite of that is a podcast filled with stories or examples that ground what you're saying in the most accessible way possible to the rest of the audience. Another thing is what emotions or experiences shape your perspective. So maybe you're absolutely, totally against the Musina Mercado Special Economic Zone. You're absolutely angry at the government that they could propose this. Think about the emotions that you feel and the experiences that shape your perspective. You're angry because you've seen how, I don't know, minds abuse their power in communities, and you just have there's research that shows, whatever. What emotions and experiences shape your perspective? Important, makes what you say very powerful. So write down your key points. Another thing to do is also to practice answering questions aloud. So you will have the questions that your host is asking you. I mean, the host could ask you something different as well on the day, but you have the main questions. Practice saying what you want to say aloud. If you want to practice in front of someone else, you can ask them, am I getting my message out? Am I understandable? Do I need to add more examples? Then, if you are recording from your home, so if you're not in Joburg and you're not able to come into the studio and you're recording from your home, you need to find a quiet space with stable internet, and you need to use earphones and headphones if you can. So, yeah, that always works because that helps cancel out the background noise. Like now, I'm not using headphones. I wonder if you can hear all these cars driving past where I'm speaking to you from, and that's something we don't want in a podcast. Then just to remind you that a podcast is recorded. It's not a live radio interview. There's not like 5,000 people listening to you live. It's recorded and it's going to be edited. So if the host takes you by surprise with the question or you forget what you were going to say, you can absolutely pause. You can think. If you don't know the answer, you can say you're not sure. You can make so many mistakes. You can tumble around your words, or you can say, oh, that's not what I meant to say. And it's absolutely fine. You can say that, you can make a mistake and say, I made a mistake. I want to start answering the question again. And you can do that because it's going to be edited. And again, just reiterating what I said earlier, natural conversations are better than sounding scripted. So it's absolutely fine or encouraged not to have your entire script of what you're going to say and to just speak the way you normally speak. And when you make mistakes, we'll edit the mistakes out. And then again, just reminding you that a good podcast often or response often has personal stories, clear examples, practical impacts on people's lives, and actually solutions and hope for change. So if wherever it's possible, it's good to have hope. You know, I think as activists, we're so good at describing the problem and exactly how bad the problem is and exactly who is to blame and why and how angry we are. But something that's always uplifting and helpful is to have possible solutions, to kind of practice hope as a discipline, and allow listeners as well to feel some kind of hope um, amid all the doom and gloom. Okay, I think this we've definitely been over a little bit, but just to reiterate, some of the most common podcast mistakes to avoid: sounding overly formal. And I think that was Boosie's point, sounding very formal, using too much jargon, acronyms. You know, as we said, we're trying to make the conversation as accessible as possible. And it's always, you know, how people tell you, explain something like you're explaining it to your 80-year-old grandmother who has no idea what you're talking about. That's always useful. It's better to assume people have no context at all than to alienate them with all this like technical expertise and knowledge. And then another thing that is not great is when you speak for too long without pausing. As we said, or as I've been saying, we're trying to sound natural. We're trying to have a conversation. So pausing, speaking slowly, and also giving other guests a chance and not kind of hogging the mic. And hopefully, a good host won't allow you to hog the mic, but a good guest as well won't hog the mic. So just to be cognizant that everybody needs to speak, and we need to share the airtime. And then you don't need to feel pressured to have all the answers. As I said earlier, it's also okay to say, I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to this question. I was thinking about it. I don't know. You know, because what you're trying to do is you're trying to open up a conversation and you're trying to kind of inspire conversation, and you're not trying to have some perfect answer. Okay, this I think we've also kind of touched on, but what makes a strong podcast topic? Strong podcasts or good topics are timely and relevant. So, for example, something that we're planning on doing, and I know Nomfundo has expressed interest in this, is speaking about climate disasters, for example, the flooding that took place in KZN. And that's timely and relevant because we are consistently having flooding and disaster all over the country. I mean, we all saw those horrific pictures out of the Western Cape last week as well. You know, good topics are connected to lived experience. They're linked to justice, to inequality, or organizing. They're grounded in community reality, and they are easy for broad audience to understand. Velilia, do you want to say something? No? Oh, that must have been a mistake. So I have some examples, but honestly, all of the people who have come to me with potential topics have always given me good topics. But some examples are flood impacts in communities, energy poverty, food insecurity and climate change, community victories and campaigns. Sure, if you have a good story, a victory story, some way that a community has won in some way, that is so valuable. We would love to hear good news stories on our podcast. If you have succeeded against your municipality, you managed to clean up your drinking water or whatever it is, that would be great. So if you have good news stories, please, please do pitch them. Okay. Then these are just some practical tips for recording. And I know I have like 2 minutes, but I'm almost done. If you are joining online, before you're recording, remember to test your internet connection. Remember to charge your phone or your laptop, whatever device you're using, fully. You don't want your battery to die while you're making an amazing point. To use earphones or headphones when possible. Close all your unnecessary tabs and apps. I should be taking my own advice because you can probably hear when I get an email while I'm speaking. Join the meeting 10 to 15 minutes early. That just helps sort out any technical hiccups to make sure that you are clear and you're audible, your connection is stable. It's always good to join early. And then choosing a recording space. Try to record in a quiet room with minimal echo, away from traffic, from fans, from TVs, loud conversations. And then just a tip is that soft furnishings like curtains, couches, and blankets help absorb the sound. I remember actually recording a podcast during COVID in my cupboard with a blanket over my head because my house was so noisy. Everybody was working from home, and that was like the quietest that I could be. But yeah, just try to be in a quiet space. Okay, during the recording, try not to keep the microphone directly against your mouth because like people can hear when you're swallowing and that kind of thing. So it needs to be close, but not directly against your mouth. Mute your notifications, avoid typing while speaking. So maybe you're taking notes, but actually you might want to use a pen and paper rather than typing because typing makes quite a sound. Speak clearly and at a natural pace. Don't go too quickly. And we spoke about that. So even if you're nervous, just try and slow it down. And then another thing we already spoke about, if you lose your train of thought, just pause and restart your sentence because we can just edit later. And if something goes wrong, don't panic because things always go wrong. This is life. So sometimes you might have an internet issue. Maybe you stumble over your words, you have to start again. Maybe dogs are barking while you're speaking or children are interrupting you. That's all okay. You can reconnect, you can start again, and we will edit. And then if you are arriving in studio, so this is more for folks in Joburg who maybe are arriving in studio, or if you recording at another studio. Confirm the studio location and arrival time beforehand. Make sure you know exactly where you're going so you know how long it'll take you to travel there. Bring some water if needed. This can be quite important because when you speak for a long time, then you need to hydrate, It affects the sound quality. It affects the way you speak. So bring some water. Oh, this is an important one. Wear comfortable clothing and not clothing that makes a lot of noise. When we recorded the Coal No Coal for Genocide podcast, I wasn't speaking, but I was in studio and I was wearing those tracksuit pants that go shh, shh, shh every time you move. And it was like the worst mistake ever because I couldn't even move while they were recording in case it affected the sound quality. So also think about what you're wearing. Something soft is better. And then eat beforehand, of course, so you're comfortable during the recording, your tummy's not rumbling, you're able to think. Yeah. And then if you're in studio, of course, the production team will help you with all your mic setup, headphones, recording process, audio checks. So no one needs technical experience to be a podcast guest. Yeah, more practical tips. No, try not to shuffle papers. Maybe you have your preparation notes. You want to like lay them next to each other. You don't want to be like looking for the page and shuffling and losing this page and that page falls on the floor and then it's just too chaotic, Avoid speaking over others. Try and speak when a question is directed to you. Don't worry if you make mistakes. And then this one is an interesting one, but body language does matter. Because even though this is an audio, people can actually pick up on your body. Like the way you sound is almost always reflective of your body language. So when you smile, your voice sounds warmer. When you're relaxed, like say your posture is relaxed, it just helps with your breathing and helps you to speak naturally. So think about your body language, take a few deep breaths before you speak. Yes, smile if you want to sound warmer. And treat the podcast like a conversation, not a performance. I think that might be my last slide. Yep, it is. Just reminding you all that all of your voices are 100% valid. Everybody in this room has the expertise and the lived experience to be on a podcast. You are already qualified. You already have expertise. All we need to do is channel your ideas. Remember that podcasts are not only for experts, they're for community members, community leaders, activists, workers, organizers, and specifically on Just Us and the Climate, we're here to document your struggles, to share lessons, and to build solidarity. And then just there's, I know Busi already put it in the chat, or someone did, but here's our website with our particular podcast. And then you can see the way we've promoted the podcasts on our social media. But that is it from me. I think I can give you guys like a few minutes to ask questions, even though we're 5 minutes over. I can give you 5 minutes maybe, if there are any questions or comments. Or anything. Lucy?
Are there any sort of like copyright infringement issues that we should take into account when we're doing a podcast? Because I know sometimes with music, sometimes they'll say, "Oh no, you can't use that because of copyright issues." Are there any sort of specific copyright issues we should be aware of?
Oh, that's a good question. Luckily, we don't need to worry about that. So if you have an example, so say for example, you tell me you want, I don't know, a Michael Jackson song in the background at the end of your podcast, for example, you will just write that in your requests and they will, for whatever reason, they will check it out and see if it can happen. And if it can't happen, they'll let us know. So you dream big, and then we will be brought down